Let's begin. So in this short webinar, I'm going to cover just a few aspects of what I would normally talk about in our diploma in creativity. I'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. I will also be talking about creative practice. Now, as a philosopher, I lean towards creativity theory myself, but I am a Wittgensteinian philosopher, which means I follow a particular philosopher who was professor of philosophy here in Cambridge, Wittgenstein. And his approach was one that said, it can't just be about theory, there has to be some sort of practical application for our thinking. And so always I'm trying to look for some practical output for the things I think about. And that's what I'm going to try and deliver today as well, just talking about some of the practical ways in which we can solve problems in business in a creative way. So I'll begin just briefly explaining our approach to creativity here at ICE. It's a relatively new field, by which I mean it's not really a field at all. It's an interdisciplinary problem, creativity. How do we promote creativity? How do we make it accessible and open to our will? How do we make ourselves more creative? And so it draws on a lot of different disciplines, but ICE has a particular approach that I will talk to you about in a moment. I'll then cover some of the problems associated with understanding creativity from a theoretical perspective, and then we'll go into some practical suggestions for what that theory tells us about how to develop creativity. I am relatively new to the creativity in business discussion. My background, as I say, is in philosophy, which is simply to say there are probably people on this webinar who are equally, if not better, skilled at explaining some of these topics. But partly, as you'll see, the discussion is about collaboration. It's about co-creation. It's about working together to reach useful and creative solutions to problems. So I'm hoping that this won't just be a one-way street anyway, even though it feels a little bit like it as I talk into my screen. But let's get started. So the first question I want to think about is why we're looking at creativity now. Why is it suddenly such an important topic? Now, at the individual level, for each of you, there is a reason why we might be interested in creativity, because it allows us to move through careers, and we are living in an age when we have multiple careers. We are living in an age when, for instance, industries can be suddenly changing, and so we need to be able to adapt the skills that we have, the knowledge that we have, and apply it in new scenarios. Now, of course, that has an impact on business, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why creativity tops the list of soft skills that employers are looking for. Creativity is right at the top, followed by persuasion, collaboration, adaptability, and emotional intelligence, some of which you might say are involved in creativity anyway. But what I want you to think about as well, and we've got a poll coming up for this, which is to ask what you think is the main reason why businesses are seeking to develop employees' creativity. As I say, I have my reasons for thinking it's related to issues around productivity. How can we sort of fill that productivity gap that we keep hearing about? It's also partly related to career development. How can I become a more effective, more productive person myself, but also how can I move on in my career? It's about ideation, and that might be a new word. We'll talk about it in a moment as well, but it essentially means idea creation. How can they form new ideas, and how can companies get their employees to form new ideas? Future-proofing not just your own career, but also businesses. As we see the rise of automation, will we see certain jobs going by the wayside? But of course, what's useful in this is that so far we haven't created AI that can think creatively, or at least we don't think so. And so as we see the rise of automation, we see a greater emphasis and a greater valuing of those things that are uniquely human. The other reason I think that we sort of picked it up here at ICE as well is because education has its part to play. And I'm going to talk about this in a moment as well. But what we're talking about in education is this emphasis on soft skills. And that's partly because there's an increased accessibility to hard facts. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example. If I were to ask you this question, in what year did the Battle of Salamis, that's Salamis, not Salamis, although that could be an interesting question as well. But what year did the Battle of Salamis take place? Now, you will all reach for your phones, and I would imagine within 30, 40 seconds, you might have an answer ready. Feel free to post that on the chat if you suddenly find the answer. So the point is, we aren't necessarily in desperate need, certainly in business, of having to draw upon these facts. So the question is, why in an exam would you be required to remember this fact about the Battle of Salamis and bring it with you in your mind and be able to reproduce it in an exam room? Because in business, if you're an engineer, the formulas are going to be available to you online, but they're also going to be part of a process. Hopefully you will also understand the formulas and understand the background behind them. But understanding is a soft skill. It's not a hard fact. So the point is, how much of this hard facts, how many of these hard facts are actually required in this day and age? And shouldn't there be at least a greater emphasis on the ability not simply to know the facts, but to be able to interpret them, adapt them, apply them in different circumstances, see their significance, see their values, and so on. And this is what's led Norman Jackson to say that the world needs people who can combine their thinking, knowledge, capabilities, and values in imaginative ways. Universities had this vital role in creating more creative societies, but all too often this creative development of learners is more by accident than design. So how might we design a university that is more capable and willing to support the creative development of students? Now, this was the question that was essentially put to me when I was asked to develop courses in creativity here at ICE. What are they for? Who are they benefiting? What's the sort of output from this? And interestingly, I started immediately, and exactly as Norman says, by thinking, well, hang on a lot of the courses I've taught on or studied on, creativity or creative thinking has been a skill I've been said that they've said that I would develop. But I do remember now, we didn't really ever talk about how we were developing our creativity, whether we were developing our creativity, and so on. And it seems to me a fundamental question as to how we are developing creativity, how we assess that, how do we know that students are actually getting better at thinking creatively? So these sorts of problems were the ones facing me when I developed the undergraduate diploma in creativity theory, history, and philosophy. But I had certain things to go on here because ICE itself is set up in a certain way. We're about adult education, we're about active learning, and we're about interdisciplinarity. So let's start with that last one. Creativity is itself, as I've said, an interdisciplinary problem. How do we make it more biddable? And of course, what this draws upon is the arts, absolutely, but also the sciences, psychology, genetics, understanding how the brain works. We also have to understand things like the history of the ideas behind them as well. And so there's philosophy, there's science, there's arts, there's all sorts of things going on. And interestingly, ICE is just that kind of place. It's an interdisciplinary teaching institution. My colleagues are not philosophers. They are scientists, social scientists, historians, archaeologists, and so on. And so we can harness that capacity that we have, not just for adult education, but also for interdisciplinarity, and apply it to teaching creativity to people who are interested in developing it for professional reasons, or even just for the joy of it. And one of the ways in which we do this, I realized very early on, was that the student-teacher relationship was known to be quite the same as it was before. That's actually not quite true, because in adult education, generally, the student and teacher are on a much more equitable level than they would be, for instance, at school, or perhaps in a standard classroom of 18 to 21-year-olds. And what I mean by that is essentially that you've got people coming with a rich history themselves. They are themselves coming from an interdisciplinary background. They've got a professional background, but they're living full lives, but they might have had multiple careers and so on. And what we're doing is we're working much more closely with them because they bring so much more to the table. Only half of the story can be told by me. I can tell them the theory, but they have to understand how they're going to apply it in their lives. And so this immediately changed the sort of the balance between the student and the teacher. And I realized that what we needed was something like co-creation. Well, how does this unpack? Well, in one sense, we looked at assignments and assessment. How do we assess a student in creativity? How do I know whether they're creative or simply erratic? And I simply just can't explain what they're doing. Well, one of the ways in which we do this is by sitting down with them, asking them what they want to achieve, asking them what they want to get from the work, and then pushing them, encouraging them to do better. But at the same time, they'll push us. So I had a student this year who said, I've got a concrete question that I need a concrete answer to. My boss is going to want to know, what did I learn on this course and how can I apply it in my job? So that's pushed me, because now I can't just talk in these philosophical terms. I have to find this really grounded and rooted concrete answer to his question. And so we work together through the assignments. And what you do is you write your assignments, you get your feedback from us, but you don't get a grade. You get to understand the feedback, you get to work with that feedback, you get to learn how to apply feedback correctly. And then you do that, you get your work sort of balanced out as a mode of co-creation. and then you submit it at the end of the course, and only then do you get a grade. And the idea behind this was also the idea that students would then feel freer, more open. After all, they're going to be writing in subjects they're not familiar with. They might have done philosophy before, but they haven't done history or science or psychology. So how are they supposed to write an essay that deals with those subjects? Well, we'll show them how, and they'll develop those skills as they go through. And so they'll be learning the skills needed in all these sorts of different disciplines, but always around a central problem, namely creativity. And so I sit in this sort of central point, this sort of red triangle I've pictured in the middle, and so does the course. It's designed around this approach to thinking. And all the time we're thinking, how does creative theory point the way forward for how people should learn? And there is a reason why I'm talking about it here and now, and it's to point out that this does have professional development at its heart. It does have this focus on how do we get better in business, how do we become more creative and solve our problems in more imaginative ways. Okay, so I'm rattling through this fairly quickly. I'm glad that it's being recorded because you'll be able to have the recording and you might be able to play that back if any of this is going a bit quickly, but I just want to make sure we cover everything. So the first question we might ask when we're studying creativity is, what is it? And I don't really want to answer that here, and I don't really try and answer it in the diploma either. Even in a year, I won't necessarily give the students that particular answer. What I will is give them perhaps 15 different answers. And the idea behind that is that there's no one definition of creativity that I think is definitive. They are definitions, and I also, interestingly, think they are useful. I don't reject them either. I resist them as being the be-all and end-all, but I recognize that they each have value in different ways. And invariably, you'll see creativity theorists like me saying things like, there is no one definition of creativity, but the one I prefer is, and I've done this. And the answer, by the way, to the question of which one I prefer is serious play. It's a form of serious play. It's taking something serious, but at the same time as recognizing that the rules can be manipulated, not broken, but manipulated, made, in fact, and we'll talk about that shortly. So rather than seek a definition of creativity, what I would ask you is perhaps, again, to share in the chat box where, when, and with whom you think you are creative. And this is really important. This is not just a kind of a fun little thing to do during a webinar. It's a really important question to keep asking yourself, because that kind of ostensive definition, which is to say pointing and saying that's creative, that's not creative, is really useful to understanding what creativity involves. And you probably have noticed there's a banana duct taped to my slides. And those of you familiar with the piece of art will know that it comes from Art Basel, and then it's called The Comedian. And I think for me, this is an object that I would point to and say, isn't it interesting when it comes to creativity? Because it's called The Comedian. And I study both philosophy and creativity, but also the philosophy of humor. And in there too, I talk about a theory of humor, which is called play, which involves breaking the implicit rules of a game. And here we have something breaking the implicit rules of what art is. But in art, this happens quite a lot. So in a way, what this does quite nicely is it puts it on the wall. It makes it fixed. It gives you a point of reference for what it means to break rules. It's slightly risible, but it's also quite serious. It's saying something about what art is. And so you can treat it as this kind of quite jokey thing. And of course the artist calls it comedian, but at the same time, you know, it's what's important to him. It's his bread and butter, or his banana bread and butter. Sorry, that was terrible. I apologize. Okay. So another thing about creativity that we have to bear in mind is that we use this one term, but are we referring to one thing? And in business, of course, we'll use the terms on the right-hand side of the screen an awful lot. We'll talk about critical thinking, ideation, which again means creating ideas. We'll talk about innovation and problem solving and disruption, disruptive technologies and how we harness those. Now, interestingly, I've left one out because it's probably the least familiar of all these terms, which is anti-fragility. Now, we all know what fragility is. It means that, for instance, when difficult circumstances arise and we have to start teaching online, for instance, how do we do this? Are we going to be able to play with that and run with that idea, or are we going to buckle? And so a company, for instance, that's facing this pandemic might well think, well, how do I make myself anti-fragile? How do I make it so that difficult circumstances don't make me weaker, they make me stronger? And this is this term anti-fragility. And so we can break creativity down into these more and more interesting concepts. And always we must remember that creativity refers to all of these things and more. I fully appreciate that it refers to more than this. But I also want to stress that we are all always doing these sorts of things. Maybe not always, but we're all doing these sorts of things. Whether or not we're working in creative industries, we are definitely being creative. So this is a good reason why we might all therefore want to be able to create more effectively. So here's one piece of practical advice, my first piece of practical advice. And this is often misunderstood, which is why I wanted to talk about it. So there's this term permission to fail, and it has been variously rebranded, retermed, and re-understood, and I do not want to shy away from this term permission to fail. The reason I say that is because there is a reason why we need it, which is to say creativity involves making novel or neoteric things, which is to say things that are interestingly new, not just mere novelties, not just things you put on the dashboard, but things that are genuinely interesting and important and sort of bring new ideas to the fore. In doing that, though, we need to take risks, and risk necessarily implies that you might fail. So how do you ensure novelty without ensuring risk, without ensuring permission to fail? Now, what people shy away from is the term fail. The reaction is one of what I would call experiential avoidance, or what is deemed in psychology as experiential avoidance. And very quickly, what I mean by that is, in the past, we were afraid of lions and of viruses, we still are, and of various other things. And we're right to be afraid of those things. They are fear-producing, and they are to be feared. However, we're now also afraid of other things. We have fear when we stand up in front of a panel for an interview, or when we have to present our ideas to the board, or when we are just simply putting our ideas out there on social media. We get afraid. I do. So we're feeling this fear, and what we then realize is that we want to avoid fear itself, not the object of fear, but the fear itself. Sometimes for our career, for businesses to succeed, we have to do things that make us afraid. And so we want to avoid experiential avoidance. We want to stop that from happening. And the way you do that is not by being scared of a term, not by experientially avoiding failure as well, by having yet another term that we want to avoid. We need to confront it. We need to try and recognize it as positive. Now, there is in some way, it's kind of slightly mind-bending to imagine that failure could be something positive. There are trite examples of, for instance, penicillin being discovered by accident, in which case it was a failure to do something, but ultimately it was useful. But of course, against that are the myriad of different examples, like, for instance, we're looking for a vaccine to coronavirus, and if we fail, that's a bad thing, absolutely a bad thing. But there are ways in which you can make this a more positive experience, because you can say, well, firstly, we're going to have 10,000 failures before we get to the 10,00001st success, or the 10,001st iteration, which is a success. And so it's not about resigning yourself to failure. It's about embracing the capacity to fail. And I think that's what's key here. Anyway, so there are lots of people talking about this, but I just want to stress that we should be promoting permission to fail, as well as things like psychological safety. We want workplaces where people don't feel afraid of trying their hand at something out of fear that they might be graded or that they might fail. My second piece of practical advice is perhaps the more useful one, perhaps for more people, because we're not necessarily creating new ideas, but we are all working together through collaboration. And I would argue what we should be doing more is co-creation. Now, my sort of focal point for this is meeting rooms. Meeting rooms are traditionally not the most creative spaces. I have heard from people who have fantastic ideas, like, for instance, the most junior person in the business always speaks first. I think that's a lovely idea, because what that does is it brings new voices into a discussion, and it's always the first thing you're hearing, and so it kind of shakes up certain biases that you might have that you naturally engender in a business. But generally, meeting rooms, if I asked you to picture one, people are sitting down. There's one person speaking at a time, perhaps. Questions are being asked for feedback, which are noted down in minutes, and so on and so on. And what the problem with this is that's trying to gather together different minds, to have a meeting of minds, to have a sharing of information. But what was really instructive for me was actually a lesson that came from a screenwriter friend of mine who said, never write dialogue. Do what Tarantino does. Real conversations are about overlapping monologues. That's exactly what happens. And this happens in our own lives. This is going to be embarrassing, but this is going to be true. In your lives, I suspect, when you're talking to other people, what you're probably doing more than listening is waiting for them to stop talking so that you can say the thing that you were going to say 2 minutes ago before they start, just as they started. That's kind of embarrassing, but we have to confront these home truths. And the truth is that's kind of what we do. And so listening is really hard. And I mean, I'm not poking fun at particular people here. I'm saying as human beings, we aren't very good at listening to other people. But also, we tend to come into meetings with our own abstract ideas, and then what you have is just abstract idea, abstract idea, abstract idea, and no real collaboration between them. Someone tries to describe what they're saying, but they're coming from a discipline, or at least from a department, that other people aren't going to necessarily be be able to readily understand. So what I suggest is that as much as meetings can be, they should be turned into something more like an action scene, less of a dialogue, more of an action scene. We need something like an object, again, like I'm using the example of meetings to try and give an example of what collaboration and co-creation can be. Similarly, when you're in a meeting, what you want is an object that can be an expression of the problem that we're focused on. And it needs to be manipulable. And one example of this, which I have done, which I was cynical about to start with, was Lego Serious Play. Yes, they got the brand name first, so I cannot brand name Serious Play. That's theirs forever now, but never mind. But their Lego Serious Play, which is the fact that they picked that name is fantastic anyway. But they took this, the idea, and I've actually got some of the Lego here in a little jiffy bag, which I still use at times. But what they do is they get everyone to have the same set of Lego, and everyone is asked to reproduce the problem. So they take their abstract problem, they put it into something concrete. And now they've got something they can manipulate, but they've got something they can explain to other people. And they're not explaining now through some private understanding of a problem. They're explaining through something that someone can immediately recognize and say, oh, right, so if you took that wall down, what would that mean for the problem? I know what it means for your model, but what does it mean for the actual problem that we're facing? So there are limitations here, but the point limitations with the way meetings are done now. So if you're looking to shake things up, there's some suggestions, but they can be simpler things. They can be things like people working around flip charts, making sure that people from different departments are collaborating, perhaps in teams, around flip charts, and then reporting on those flip charts to other people, that kind of thing. All that kind of work is much more useful, I would say, in communicating ideas and collaborating across a problem. A third suggestion here is really for people who are engaged in ideation, so engaged in creativity, but this would go in your daily life as much as it would in a workplace. And it's not my idea at all. It actually comes from Sally Hogshead, but she has this wonderful phrase called the throne of agony, which sounds horrendous, but it really does encapsulate what she wants to get across. And that is basically that our thought processes when we're coming up with ideas go through 5 stages. We have lots of possibilities. So if I give you a task, like give me all the different uses for a brick, and that includes using it as a pot plant holder or something like that. Anyway, but all the different uses for a brick. But let's take another one. Let's say you're coming up with an app for teachers to make their lives easier. Before I've even finished speaking, you've got some ideas. But if you're working in a group or you're working alone, you start to write ideas down furiously. As time goes on, you might cross out some of those ideas, and you might only be adding a few more to the list until eventually you run dry, you hit a drought. And that's the throne of agony. And almost every process of ideation will reach this stage. Again, this isn't a universal rule, this is a general principle. But then at some stage, someone will say something silly. Perhaps you, perhaps someone in your group will say, hang on, just because we're designing an app for teachers doesn't mean that it has to be around pedagogy, around teaching and assessment, etc. Couldn't it just be a diet for teachers to help them, stay alert during the hours of the day, etc., to avoid them getting tired and so on? So, or a way of segmenting time so that they don't bring their marking home with them and they're able to do it elsewhere. So again, all these different things that we could come up with for managing life, not necessarily managing teaching. And then suddenly the wellspring opens up again. And here's the epiphany. And then the process is one of finesse, and you're going through and you might say, well, actually, why can't we take many of these ideas and put them into one app? And so on and so on and so on. And my idea here isn't to suggest a process for coming up with these ideas. I would love to actually do this exercise with you, in fact, but it's difficult to do remotely. But maybe you could do this at home. And what you will see is this at least something like this shape happening. And you have to push through the process of agony. But what helps you through that agony is disruptive thinking. It's that first challenge to the implicit rules of the game. And this is where I got interested in creativity initially. I'm a philosopher, and in philosophy, what we typically do is we open people's minds to new possibilities. So I have students walk into my class who are probably Cartesians. And I imagine many of the people on this call are Cartesians without even knowing it, by which I mean you believe that you have a mind and you have a body. And those two things are different. And what I'll do to students is I'll say, you are all Cartesians. You're now going to read Descartes, read his meditations, and you're going to say what a buffoon he is. And you're going to say he's wrong about everything. I don't like any of it. And then you're going to leave this room as Cartesians. You're still going to hold on to the idea that you have a mind and that you have a body. Isn't that a problem? Isn't that something that we should all be worried about? So essentially, I'm challenging them from day one to start thinking in new ways, to let go of their biases, to challenge their thinking and come up with new ideas. And so creative thinking and philosophical thinking are very similar. I've said that creative thinking is at once entirely philosophical and less than that. And when I say less than that, what I mean is at no point do we have to close down again. There's no second prism that's introduced to this new shattered wavelength to sort of narrow things down, unless it is, as in the picture on the right, to try and narrow out some of the possibilities. But certainly philosophers often end on one possibility, and creatives don't want to do that. They don't want one option. They want to keep creating the same work of art again and again and again. And at the same time, often in philosophy, that one option is do nothing. Well, that's no good for creatives either. So what we're doing is just this first stage, just this opening up of people's minds. And comedy does this too, as I've said earlier. And what essentially comedy does is it makes you see the familiar as strange and the strange as familiar, exactly as philosophy does. In fact, that was William James who said that about philosophy, and he's a psychologist, he should know how strange philosophers are. But to give you an example from comedy, Bill Murray tells this joke. He says, balloons are strange things. Happy birthday. Here's a sack of my breath. Now that is a very, it's a very funny joke. It's very tight, it's very constrained. But essentially what he's doing is he's pointing out how strange it is that we do this thing called giving of balloons. And he shines a light on that. And the minute you shine a light on it, it's either funny or it's interesting or it's, and so on. And this is what philosophy does, and this is what creativity does. But you need to shine that light. And essentially this is a process called design thinking. The light that you shine is exactly the same light that you shine in philosophy, which is to say, where's the problem? What exactly is the problem you're facing? And you can often be surprised by what the problem is, as opposed to what you think perhaps before you thought the problem was. So I was talking to an engineer who's going to come and teach for us on creativity recently, and he was saying that he had a friend and he broke his leg during the pandemic. Not great, needs to get a wheelchair. How does he get one during the pandemic? Well, actually, so his problem is, how do I get a wheelchair? But this engineer said to him, well, look, let's think this through. What's the problem? You're in your flat, you're not going out, you're locked down, and if you did go out, you wouldn't really enjoy yourself. You've got a broken leg. So you're staying in your flat. What do you need to do? And so he started listing all the things he needs to do, and he would come up with solutions for each of those problems. Done. The problem wasn't get a wheelchair. The problem was, how do I get to the loo? How do I get to the kitchen? How do I make a cup of coffee? And so on and so on. So disruptive thinking might seem to be that it doesn't play well with others, but as in the case I've just given, it does and it can. But we need to impose some constraints on this. You can't just have people coming in willy-nilly and breaking rules all over the place. So, and in particular in other disciplines outside of philosophy, I mean, you can send bad philosophers out into the world. And they will not harm anyone. Well, they might do, but they won't do a great deal of harm, I wouldn't have thought anyway, but at least not in doing philosophy. But if you send a bad engineer out or a bad lawyer, the chances are they won't be in those professions for long. So we need a balance here. We need to recognize that the rules have to be followed, but then something extra is needed to make it creative. And Picasso put this by saying, learn the rules like a pro so that you can break them like an artist. But I prefer the idea that what we would do is we'd learn the rules like a pro so that we can make them like an artist. Artists do not disregard the past. As he's saying, learn the rules. So we are about learning the craft. We're about the technical issues involved. We are also about challenging what can be made possible through those rules. So we come up with new rules. We find new ground to break. And essentially that's not about breaking rules, that's about making rules. It's a much more creative, much more positive process. It's not about playing badly with others. The best kind of creative going into a business would say, okay, how have things been done? I need to understand what you need to do, how you're doing it, etc., in order to be able to say, well, why not try this instead? So very briefly, I want to talk about this issue, as this aspect of creativity theory as well, which is a much more recent aspect of creativity theory. And it comes from a psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi, and he advocates challenging ourselves, applying our skills, having those, learning the rules like a pro, but challenging ourselves at the same time, setting up obstacles perhaps, if none exist, making obstacles to our own development. Now that might sound very counterintuitive, but imposing obstacles can be a way of unlocking potential. And I'll give you one example, which was the Oulipo in the 1960s, were a movement of literature, ouvrir littérature potentielle, which is the potential of all of literature. They gained that potential by imposing limitations on their work. Georges Perec wrote a novel famously in French without using the letter E, which is the most common letter in the French language. That opened up possibilities. The book then became about an absence of something very familiar. And notice this is, again, informing our process at ICE of how we teach creativity. Co-creation is about challenging people. Again, we often have manager talking down in, getting employees to do this according to certain restrictions, rather than the employees going in a two-way street to challenge the manager as well. We resist that pattern, but there are ways of setting that up where you get a co-creative process where one person is challenging the other and vice versa. And that's always the ideal to aim for if we want something like this creative flow to follow. Again, if we want this creative flow to follow, there isn't creativity isn't needed all the time in every situation. So very briefly in summary, this is just simply to say that the theory informs the practice informs the theory. I do not want to let creativity be just an idea that we think about. I want it to really help with this consensus that we have, that we need more creativity in our lives. So learning the theory is one way, but certainly a key way to understanding how we promote creative practice. It doesn't mean imposing rules. It means following certain guidelines, things like resisting, but not rejecting attempts to define creativity. Accept definitions, but don't accept a definition as the definition. Foster a psychologically safe environment that gives people permission to fail, that lets them feel comfortable about trying their hand, taking risks. Risks will involve failure. That's fine. Get on, and please don't worry about it if it doesn't work out. Collaborating more and doing this through co-creation, through this two-way street. Embracing divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent meaning we have a problem, let's look at different ways to solve it, versus we have all of these different approaches to our business. How do they converge in on a particular problem? And this means thinking through things in a design way, so through design thinking, but also embracing disruptive approaches as well. Accepting that someone can come into someone's developmental process and say, why don't you do it just like this? Why don't you limit yourself in this way? Tie your hand behind your back, but metaphorically speaking. At that point, I will end, but open up for questions. I will just flag these events on the screen, which is to say we have a virtual open day on the 12th to the 13th of June. That's on both days. We also have a summer festival of learning. I'll be delivering a session both for the open day and for the summer festival of learning. I'll be teaching an introduction to creativity theory. We also have the undergraduate diploma in creativity theory, history and philosophy, which takes all of these sort of theoretical approaches and applies them. And if you want to find out more, you can just search for creativity in the search box on the website, and you'll come up with all of our short courses as well as our award-bearing courses. But please do follow us on Twitter, visit YouTube. ICE has a channel. I have a channel called ADC Philosophy, which is also my website.